My name is Clara Vance. For years, I was the shadow daughter, the one who worked 18-hour days in the cold light of a Silicon Valley office, while my sister, Isabella, was the golden flower of the family. My parents viewed my success as a communal bank account and my silence as permission. They didn't just spend my savings, they liquidated my entire life's work to buy Isabella a fairy tale. A wedding in a 12th century Italian castle, a celebration of a love built on my stolen sweat. They thought they were inviting me to a celebration. They didn't realize that the castle they were standing in didn't belong to the Vance legacy. It belonged to me. And while they were waiting for I do, I was waiting for the clock to strike 12. I'm not here to be a bridesmaid. I'm here to serve the eviction notice. The invitation was embossed with 24-karat gold leaf, the kind of excess that screamed Vance, but was paid for by Clara. It arrived at my apartment in San Francisco like a polished insult. The wedding of Isabella Vance and Count Alessandro di Rossi, Castello di Pietra, Tuscany. I sat at my mahogany desk, the very desk where I had built Vantax Holdings from a single line of code into a real estate empire, and I felt a cold, familiar ache. They hadn't called me to ask for the money. They had simply accessed the emergency trust fund my grandfather had set up for my business expansion, a fund my parents still had legacy signatory rights to, and drained it. $4 million, gone in a single transaction to an Italian event management firm. I remember the phone call I made that night. Not to my mother, whose voice would only grate on my nerves with talk of family duty and Isabella's big day. Not to my father, who viewed my bank balance as his personal retirement plan. I called my lead acquisitions officer, Marcus. "Marcus," I said, my voice as steady as the cooling fans in a server room, "that property in Tuscany we were looking at for the boutique hotel expansion, Castello di Pietra, is the deal closed?" "Signed and sealed this morning, Clara," Marcus replied. "The previous owner was desperate. We own the stones, the vines, and the air they breathe. Why?" "I want the keys, and I want a full list of the upcoming events booked there for the next month, especially the wedding scheduled for June 14th. My parents thought I was a workaholic with no social life, a girl who wouldn't notice a few million missing because I was too busy making more. They underestimated the one thing I valued more than profit: accountability. For 26 years, I had been the one to fix Isabella's mistakes, to pay off her credit cards, to ensure my parents could keep their country club memberships while their actual investments crumbled. I was the engine room of the Vance family, but I was never allowed on the deck. I spent the next 3 months working in the shadows. I didn't confront them. When my mother called to gush about the hand-painted silk drapes being imported from Lyon for the castle's ballroom, I simply smiled and said, "It sounds expensive, Mother." "Oh, Clara, don't be so drab. It's Isabella's dream. She's marrying a count. Think of the status this brings to our name. You can afford to be generous for once." Generous was their code for robbed. They had taken the $4 million I had earmarked for the acquisition of a tech incubator, a move that would have secured my company's future for a decade. They had sacrificed my future for a weekend of champagne and titles. I arrived in Italy 4 days before the ceremony. I didn't stay with the family at the luxury villa they had rented in Florence, also on my dime. I stayed at a small, discreet hotel in the hills, overlooking the Castello di Pietra. From my balcony, I could see the staff scurrying like ants, setting up the massive white marquees and the floral arches that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. I spent my days with my legal team. We went over the deed of the castle, the local eviction laws of the Tuscany region, and the specific breach of contract clauses in the event management agreement. My parents had signed the rental contract with the previous owner, but that contract contained a change of ownership clause that gave the new owner the right to terminate any event with 72 hours' notice if the security deposit, the one they had paid with my stolen money, was found to be sourced from fraudulent or disputed funds. I was the one who disputed the funds. I had already filed the paperwork in the U.S. for the unauthorized withdrawal. To the Italian law, the money paying for this wedding was dirty, and I was the only person with the power to clean it or to stop the music. On the morning of the wedding, the air was sweet with the scent of rosemary and blooming jasmine. It was a perfect day for a fairy tale. I put on a tailored black suit, no lace, no soft colors. I looked like a woman going to a board meeting, not a wedding. I tucked the legal documents into a sleek leather portfolio. My assistant, Elena, met me at the car. She was nervous. "Claire, the guest list it's everyone. The European elite, the Silicon Valley giants, the press. Are you sure you want to do it this way? The scandal will be monumental." "The scandal isn't mine, Elena," I said, sliding into the back of the black sedan. "The scandal belongs to the people who think they can build a life on someone else's ruins. My parents wanted a show. I'm just giving them a finale they'll never forget." As we drove up the winding path to the castle, I saw the Vance crest flying from the highest tower. It was an insult to the Stones. They had claimed this place as their own, telling the guests that the castle was a family acquisition to celebrate the union. They were lying to the Count, lying to the world, and lying to themselves. I stepped out of the car as the first strains of the string quartet began to echo from the courtyard. Guests in silk gowns and morning suits were sipping vintage Prosecco, whispering about the grandeur of the Vance family. I didn't go to the guest seating. I went to the manager's office. I showed my ID, the deed of ownership, and the court-stamped eviction order. The manager, a man named Roberto, turned pale. "Signora Vance, the ceremony starts in 20 minutes. You cannot be serious." "I am the owner of this property, Roberto," I said, my voice cold and absolute. "And as of this moment, this event is a trespass. You have 10 minutes to inform the caterers to stop serving. Then I will handle the rest." I walked out into the sunlight of the main courtyard. I could see Isabella at the top of the stone stairs, her lace train cascading behind her like a waterfall. She looked beautiful. She looked like a princess who had never known a day of struggle. My father stood beside her, his chest puffed out with pride, wearing a tuxedo that cost 10,000 of my dollars. They saw me. My mother waved from the front row, a triumphant glint in her eyes. She thought I had finally come around. She thought I was there to witness her greatest achievement. The music swelled. The priest began to speak in a low, sonorous Italian. "We are gathered here today in this ancient house of stone to witness the union of—" I didn't wait for the vows. I didn't wait for the "I do." I walked straight down the center aisle, the sound of my heels on the ancient cobbles cutting through the music like a drumbeat. "Stop the ceremony," I said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command that filled the space. The priest stopped. Isabella's head snapped toward me, her eyes wide with shock. My father stepped forward, his face turning a deep red anger. "Clara, what are you doing? Sit down this instant. You're ruining everything." "I'm not ruining anything, Father," I said, stepping on to the altar and opening the leather portfolio. "You see, there's a small detail you missed in your excitement to spend my money. This castle doesn't belong to the De Rossi family, and it certainly doesn't belong to the Vances. It belongs to Vantex Holdings, which means it belongs to me." A collective gasp went through the crowd. I saw the Count's face go from confusion to horror. He looked at Isabella, who was trembling so hard her bouquet of lilies was shaking. "This wedding is over," I announced, turning to the guests. "The funds used to book this venue were stolen from my corporate accounts. Under Italian law, this is an illegal assembly on private property. Roberto, show the guests to the gates. The security team is waiting to escort."
My dear ones, thank you for listening to this story. It makes me incredibly happy to feel that you are here with me. I try my best for you and post new videos every day, putting a piece of myself into them. If my stories resonate with you, your subscription and viewing of other videos will be the warmest support for me and inspiration to continue telling stories.
There is a specific kind of silence that follows a public execution. It's not the absence of sound, but the presence of shock so heavy it swallows the air. As I stood on the altar of the Castello di Pietra, the eviction notice felt like a holy relic in my hands. I watched the guests, the elite, the powerful, the judgmental, transform from witnesses of a union into spectators of a car crash. My sister's face, once the picture of bridal perfection, was now a mask of smudged mascara and raw, ugly realization. The fairy tale had been decapitated, and the body was still twitching. The first person to move wasn't my father or Isabella. It was Alessandro, the Count. He took a step back from Isabella, his hand dropping from hers as if her skin had suddenly turned to ice. In his world, a title was a fragile thing, protected by the shield of old money and unblemished reputation. The moment I mentioned stolen funds and illegal assembly, that shield shattered. "Alessandro?" Isabella's voice was a pathetic whimper, a child's plea in a woman's body. "Alessandro, she's lying. She's just jealous. Clara has always been crazy." "Jealous?" I laughed, the sound echoing off the 12th century stone walls. "Isabella, I've spent the last decade being your benefactor. I don't envy your life. I've been paying for it. Do you want to see the wire transfer records? I have them right here on my tablet. $4 million moved from the Vantex Expansion Fund to Tuscan Dream Events via an unauthorized signature from our father. That's not jealousy. That's a felony." My father finally found his voice. He didn't use it to apologize. He used it to attack. He lunged toward me, his face a terrifying shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging above his silk bow tie. "You ungrateful, cold-hearted bitch. I gave you life. I gave you the name that opened every door for you, and you come here to humiliate us in front of the Count? In front of our friends?" "You didn't give me the name, Father," I said, not flinching as he reached the edge of the altar. Two of my security guards, men I had flown in from London, stepped forward quietly. They didn't touch him, but their presence was a wall he couldn't scale. "I made the name worth something. When you took it over, it was associated with bad debts and failed country clubs. I turned Vance into a brand, and you just used that brand to commit fraud." The guests began to murmur, a low tide of whispers that quickly rose into a storm of gossip. I saw a prominent tech journalist from Wired, a man my father had personally invited to document the prestige, feverishly typing on his phone. The story was already leaving the courtyard. It was hitting the wires before the first bottle of champagne had even been fully emptied. "Clara, please!" My mother was on her knees now, her designer gown dragging through the dust of the ancient stones. She wasn't praying, she was performing. She looked at the guests, then at me, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. "Think of the family. If you do this, we are ruined. Alessandro's family, they will never forgive this. You're destroying your sister's life." "Isabella's life was built on a lie, Mother," I replied, looking down at her. "I'm not destroying it, I'm just stopping the theft. If Alessandro loves her, he'll marry her in a courthouse in a plain dress, but he won't be doing it in my castle, and he won't be doing it with my money." I turned to Alessandro. He looked like he wanted to vanish into the masonry. "Count Di Rossi, I suggest you take your family and leave through the north gate. My staff has already prepared your luggage. You're victim of their deception as much as I am, but as of this moment, the Vances have no credit here. Any expenses incurred from this point forward will be billed directly to you. Do you wish to take responsibility for a $4 million debt?" Alessandro didn't hesitate. He didn't even look at Isabella. He turned to his parents, a stern-looking couple who looked like they had stepped out of a Renaissance portrait, and gave a sharp nod. "We were told the Vances were the primary investors in the Vantex portfolio. If this is not true, then the marriage contract is based on a fraudulent premise. The union is void." The sound Isabella made then wasn't a sob, it was a scream of pure, unadulterated rage. She threw her bouquet at me, 100 white lilies hitting the floor and scattering like broken teeth. "I hate you! I hate you! You've always hated me because I was the pretty one, because Mom and Dad loved me more." "They didn't love you more, Isabella," I said, finally feeling a flicker of pity. "They just found you easier to use. You were the trophy they could show off, while I was the engine they kept hidden. They didn't give you this wedding because they loved you. They gave it to you because they wanted to feel powerful again. They used you as bait for a count's title." Roberto, the manager, stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Signora Vance, the catering staff has stopped. The guests are being directed to the shuttle buses, but your parents, they have nowhere to go. Their villa rental was canceled this morning due to payment irregularities." "I know. I'm the one who flagged the credit card. It was a corporate card they had no right to use." My father collapsed into a chair. The pride drained out of him, leaving only a hollow, elderly man in an expensive suit. "Where are we supposed to go, Clara? We're in the middle of Tuscany. We have nothing." "You have exactly what you had when you decided to steal from me. Each other. You can call a taxi. I've left your personal suitcases at the gate. Everything else, the decorations, the silk drapes, the imported flowers, stays here. It's my collateral." As the courtyard began to empty, the scene became surreal. The string quartet was packing their instruments in total silence. The waiters were clearing half-eaten appetizers with the efficiency of a cleaning crew at a crime scene. Isabella was sitting on the stairs, her white dress spread out around her, looking like a discarded doll. I walked over to her. I didn't gloat, I didn't smile. I just looked at the girl I had spent my life protecting, only to realize I had been enabling her destruction. "The Count is gone, Isabella," I said quietly. "His car just cleared the north gate. He didn't leave a note." "You did this to me," she whispered, her eyes fixed on nothing. "You did this to me." "No, our parents did this to us. They told you you were a princess so they could play at being kings. I'm just the one who turned the lights off." My father looked up at me, his eyes full of a new kind of hatred, the kind that comes from knowing you've been thoroughly beaten by someone you considered a servant. "You think you've won. You're alone, Clara. You have your money and your castle, but you have no one. We were your only family." If this is what family looks like, Father, theft, lies, and emotional blackmail, then alone is the most beautiful word in the English language. Now get out of my castle. I have a business to run, and the cleaning crew arrives in 10 minutes. I don't want to pay them overtime to sweep up the remains of your ego. I stood on the balcony as the last taxi pulled away. The sun was beginning to set over the Tuscan hills, painting the vineyards in shades of gold and deep purple. For the first time in years, the crushing weight in my chest was gone.
The expansion fund was gone, but I had acquired something much more valuable. The Castello di Pietra was silent now. The music had stopped, the guests were gone, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the shadow daughter. I was the master of the house. I took out my phone and dialed Marcus. "The property is clear," I said. "Send the architects. We start the hotel conversion tomorrow. And Marcus, tell the legal team to prepare the civil suit against my father. I want every cent of that $4 million back, even if I have to take it from their Social Security." I hung up and looked at the empty courtyard. The fairy tale was over. My life was finally beginning.
Victory has a distinct, cold flavor. It tastes of iron and ancient dust. As the first week of my ownership passed, the Castello di Pietra transformed from a theater of vanity into a fortress of industry. My architects walked the halls where Isabella had planned to dance, their laser measures clicking like staccato applause. But while I was drawing blueprints for the future, my family was rotting in the past. They had moved from the peak of Tuscan luxury to a roadside motel with flickering neon signs and the smell of industrial cleaner, a place where the Vance name meant nothing, and my credit card was the only thing standing between them and the street. I sat in the solar of the castle, the room once designated as the bride's dressing room. Now it was my command center. 3 monitors were perched on a 16th-century oak table, displaying the fluctuating stock of Vantex holdings and the frantic, desperate emails from my father's attorney. "Clara," Marcus said, stepping into the room with a stack of legal folders, "your father is refusing the settlement. He's not just fighting the civil suit, he's threatening to go public. He sent a manifesto to several tech blogs. He's claiming that your initial seed funding for Vantex was filtered through offshore accounts he set up to avoid tax liabilities. He's trying to paint you as a corporate fraud." I didn't look up from the screen. "He's desperate, Marcus. A drowning man will try to pull the lifeguard under with him. But my father forgets one thing. I coded every transaction of Vantex. I kept the receipts he thought I was too young to understand. If he opens that door, he's not exposing me. He's providing the evidence for his own tax evasion." I decided it was time for a site visit, not to the motel, but to the legal reality of their situation. I had restricted their daily allowance on the emergency card I had provided to exactly €50 a day. It was enough for pasta and a bus ticket, but not enough for the vintage Bordeaux my father craved. The phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice, once so sharp and commanding, was now thin and reedy. "Clara, Isabella won't eat. She hasn't left the room in 3 days. The Count's lawyers sent a formal demand for the return of the engagement ring, a De Rossi heirloom. But Clara, your father, he pawned the diamond in Florence to pay for the incidentals before the wedding. We don't have it." I felt a cold shiver of disgust. "You pawned a family heirloom of a count? That's not just a civil matter, Mother. That's a criminal one. The De Rossis will have him arrested the moment he tries to leave the country." "Please, Clara," she sobbed. "Just one more transfer. 100,000. We'll pay it back, I swear. We'll sell the house in Connecticut." "You can't sell the house in Connecticut, Mother," I said, leaning back in the heavy velvet chair. "I bought the mortgage from the bank 2 days ago. It's part of the collateral for the $4 million. You're living in a home that I own, and right now, your rent is significantly overdue." The silence on the other end was the sound of a woman finally realizing she was no longer the matriarch. She was a dependent. I drove to the motel that afternoon. I didn't take the limousine. I took a rugged rental jeep. I wanted them to see me in the dust of the road.
The Motel Belvedere was anything but beautiful. It sat on a sun-scorched patch of gravel near the highway. I found them in the small breakfast area, surrounded by plastic chairs and the hum of a vending machine. My father was huddled over his laptop, his tuxedo jacket discarded on a chair, replaced by a rumpled shirt. Isabella sat in the corner, her face hidden by oversized sunglasses, her blonde hair matted and dull. "The visionary arrives," my father spat, not looking up. "Have you come to watch us suffer? Is this part of the Vantex strategy?" "I've come to give you an ultimatum, Father. I've seen the emails you sent to the press, the offshore allegations. It's a bold move for a man who signed the tax returns for those very accounts. If you hit send on that manifesto, I will hand over the full forensic audit of the Vance Family Trust to the IRS. You won't just be poor, you'll be in federal prison." Richard Vance finally looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot, the arrogance replaced by a frantic, cornered energy. "You wouldn't. It would ruin the company. Your stock would plummet." "The market loves a cleanup story, Dad," I replied. "I'll take a 10% dip for a week, and then I'll be the hero who saved Vantex from its own founder. You, on the other hand, will be a headline in an orange jumpsuit." I placed a document on the plastic table. "This is a confession of judgment. You admit to the unauthorized withdrawal of the $4 million. You relinquish all claims to the Vance properties and the Vantex board seat. In exchange, I pay off the DeRossi family for the Pond Diamond, I settle your motel bill, and I give you a small, modest cottage in rural Maine, far away from the country clubs, far away from the cameras." "Maine?" Isabella shrieked, finally speaking. "You want us to live in a shack in the woods? I was supposed to be a countess." "You were supposed to be a sister, Isabella. You were supposed to ask where the money for your 5-tiered cake came from, but you didn't care as long as the photos looked good on Instagram. Well, the photos are gone. The count is gone. Now you're just a girl with a very expensive, very useless dress." My father looked at the pen. He looked at the document. He realized I had calculated every variable. I wasn't just his daughter. I was his landlord, his creditor, and his judge. "You've become a monster, Clara," my father whispered, "exactly like the ones you used to read about in those business books." "I learned from the best, Dad. I watched you treat people like assets for 20 years. I just applied the logic to the family business." He signed it. The Vance signature, once a symbol of unearned prestige, now was a surrender. I took the paper, the ink still wet, and felt nothing but a profound sense of closure. "The shuttle to the airport leaves in 2 hours, economy class. I've already had your things moved out of the Connecticut house. Don't go back there. The locks have been changed." As I walked out of the motel, my mother caught my arm. "Clara, will you ever come see us in Maine?" I looked at her, the woman who had helped coordinate the theft of my life's work. "I'll send a check for the property taxes every year, Mother. That's the only connection we have left." I drove back to the Castello di Pietra. The sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows across the vineyards. I walked up to the highest rampart and looked out over the land I now truly owned. The manifesto was never sent. The scandal was contained. The Vantex stock stayed steady. And as I stood there, the owner of the stones and the silence, I realized that the greatest wedding gift I could have ever given myself was the courage to stop being a guest in my own life. The castle was quiet. The war was over. And for the first time, I was truly home.
1 month. In the world of technology, that's an era. In the world of Tuscany, it's a heartbeat. The Castello di Pietra had been scrubbed of the Vance scent. The white marquees were gone, the silk drapes replaced by minimalist linen, and the air of desperate social climbing replaced by the hum of high-end hospitality. I was no longer the daughter who ruined the wedding. I was the woman who saved the estate. But just as I began to feel the cold comfort of my solitude, a ghost appeared at the gate. Not a ghost of the family I had exiled, but a ghost of the fairy tale I had dismantled. The grand opening of Vantec's retreat, Castello di Pietra, was a private affair. No press, no influencers, just a dozen of the most influential venture capitalists and heritage preservationists in Europe. I stood on the terrace, a glass of water in my hand. I needed a clear head to manage the predators in tailored suits, when a shadow fell across the ancient stone floor. "You look much more at home in the light of ownership than in the shadow of a bridesmaid, Clara," a smooth baritone voice said. I didn't need to turn around. Alessandro, Count di Rossi, the man who had abandoned my sister at the altar the second he realized her dowry was a fiction. He was dressed in a navy linen suit, looking every bit the Tuscan aristocrat, but his eyes were different. They weren't looking for a bride, they were looking for a deal. "Alessandro," I said, my voice as flat as a silicon wafer, "I believe your family's lawyers were very clear about the Di Rossi family having no further association with this property. My security team must be slipping if you made it past the gate." "You didn't climb the wall, Clara," he said, stepping beside me to look out over the vineyard. "I bought a ticket to the opening gala, or rather, my family's holding company did. We still own the rights to the water source that feeds these vines. Without our cooperation, your retreat will be a desert by next summer." I tightened my grip on the glass. He was right. In my rush to acquire the stones, I had overlooked the ancient water rights tied to the Di Rossi estate next door. It was a classic old-world trap. My father hadn't known about it, and in my haste to bury him, I had missed the fine print of the regional hydrologists. "What do you want, Alessandro?" I asked, turning to face him. "If you think I'm going to pay you off to restore your pride, you've miscalculated as badly as my father did." "Pride is a luxury I can't afford right now, Clara," he said, his expression hardening. "My family's estate is crumbling. My father's investments were as disastrous as your father's. That's why we agreed to the marriage with Isabella. We needed the Vance infusion. But now I see that the brains of the Vance family weren't in the lace dress. They were in the black suit." "Get to the point," I said. "I don't want a payoff," he said. "I want a merger. You have the capital and the technological infrastructure to turn this entire valley into a global hub for agri-tech tourism. I have the land, the titles, and the water. Together, we could own the region. Alone, you have a beautiful castle with dry pipes, and I have a title and a pile of debts." I looked at him, the man who had watched my sister sob on the floor and walked away without a word. He was a pragmatist, a predator. He was exactly the kind of person I usually did business with in San Francisco. But this wasn't California. This was personal. "And Isabella?" I asked. "Does she factor into this merger?" "Isabella is a child playing with dolls," his voice devoid of emotion. "She was a means to an end. You are a partner. There is a difference. I don't care about the Vance legacy. I care about the Di Rossi survival. I think you understand that better than anyone." I spent the next hour walking the perimeter of the property with him. He spoke of smart irrigation, of blockchain-verified wine vintages, of a vision that was surprisingly sophisticated. He had been paying attention to my career. He knew my work with Vantex better than my parents ever had. He wasn't just a count, he was a shark who happened to live in a villa. "I need to see the books of the Di Rossi estate," I said as we reached the gate. "Every debt,
every lien, every secret. If I find 1 cent unaccounted for, the deal is dead and I'll find a way to pipe water in from the coast just to spite you. I'll have them on your desk by morning, he smiled. It wasn't a romantic smile. It was the smile of a man who had found a mirror. That night, the castle felt different. The victory over my family was complete, but a new game had begun. I sat in my office reviewing the preliminary files Alessandro had sent. He was telling the truth. His family was desperate. They were land poor, holding on to thousands of hectares of prime soil, but lacking the liquidity to modernize. But then I found it, a hidden file tucked into the De Rossi liabilities folder. It was a contract dated 2 years ago between Alessandro and my father. My heart stopped. The wedding hadn't just been a social climb for my father. It had been a prearranged buyout. Alessandro had already sold the water rights to my father's shell company 2 years ago, long before the stolen trust fund came into play. I realized then that I had been played. My father didn't sign the castle rental with the previous owner. He was the underlying owner of the water rights through Alessandro. The theft of the $4 million wasn't just for a wedding. It was to cover the final payment on a secret deal to consolidate the valley. My father wasn't just a bumbling social climber. He was trying to build a rival empire to Vantex, using my own money as the foundation. And Alessandro? He was the double agent. He had played both sides. He had helped my father set the trap, and now he was trying to help me save it so he could stay in the game. I felt a cold, white-hot rage. They were still treating me like a resource. My father from his shack in Maine, and Alessandro from his crumbling villa. They thought they could use the shadow daughter to fund their new world order. I took out my phone and dialed the number for the private investigator I had hired to watch my parents in Maine. "Is my father still in the cottage?" I asked. "No, ma'am. He left 3 days ago. He's currently in Florence. He's been meeting with a representative from a De Rossi subsidiary." I hung up. I looked out the window at the dark vineyards. The war wasn't over. It had just moved to a larger map. Alessandro was still at the gala, sipping my wine, waiting for my answer. I didn't call security. I didn't scream. I sat down at my laptop and began to code. If they wanted a merger, I would give them one, but I would ensure that by the time the ink was dry, the De Rossi survival and the Vance legacy would be nothing more than footnotes in the history of Vantex Holdings. "Elena," I said as my assistant walked in, "cancel the architects. We're not building a hotel anymore. We're building a trap. And tell Alessandro I'll see him for breakfast. I have a partnership agreement he's going to love." The ghost in the vineyard wasn't a memory. It was a target.
Betrayal is a circle. My father thought he had outsmarted me by using Alessandro as a proxy, and Alessandro thought he could bridge the gap between two crumbling empires using my brilliance as the glue. They saw me as the Vantex engine, powerful, efficient, but ultimately under their control. They didn't realize that an engine can be repurposed into a wrecking ball. I didn't just want my $4 million back anymore. I wanted the water, the land, and the total erasure of the men who thought they could own me. I met Alessandro for breakfast on the castle terrace. The morning mist was clinging to the vines, and the smell of fresh espresso filled the air. He looked relaxed, confident, the perfect image of a man who had just secured his future. "I've reviewed the preliminary terms, Alessandro," I said, placing a slim black folder on the table. "The De Rossi Vantex Agri-Tech Hub has potential, but I have one condition. For this merger to have the necessary tax advantages under Italian law, the primary investment must be funneled through the De Rossi subsidiary, the one currently holding the water rights." Alessandro's eyes flickered with a brief, almost imperceptible spark of greed.
A logical move, Clara. You have a head for European fiscal policy. I'll have my father authorize the transfer of the rights into the new joint entity. Not your father, Alessandro, I said, leaning in. We need the beneficial owner. My investigators found that the rights were partially collateralized by an external partner. I want that partner at the table in Florence. If we're going to do this, there can be no ghosts in the room. He hesitated for exactly 1.4 seconds. Very well, I'll arrange it. A private villa in Florence tomorrow night. We'll sign the papers and toast to a new era. As he walked away, I felt a wave of cold satisfaction. He had taken the bait. He thought I was blinded by the prospect of owning the valley. He didn't know that every tax advantage I had mentioned was actually a red flag designed to trigger an automatic audit by the Guardia di Finanza, the Italian financial police. I spent the next 24 hours in a state of high-velocity preparation. I wasn't just coding a business deal. I was coding a digital dragnet. I reached out to my contacts in the Italian Ministry of Economy, providing them with the encrypted files I had discovered regarding the shell companies my father and Alessandro had used to hide their pre-wedding transactions. Clara, Elena said, entering the solar, the PI in Florence has confirmed your father's location. He's staying at a private residence owned by a Durossi cousin. He thinks he's about to sign a deal that gives him 25% of Vantex's Italian assets. He's signing a confession, Elena, I said. He just doesn't know the font is too small to read. The villa in Florence was a masterpiece of Renaissance architecture, all marble statues, frescoed ceilings, and a sense of history that felt like a weight. Alessandro met me at the door, looking triumphant. He led me into a candlelit library where a man was sitting in a high-backed leather chair with his back to the room. "The silent partner arrives," Alessandro announced. The chair turned. My father, Richard Vance, looked at me with a smirk that my skin crawled. He wasn't wearing the rumpled shirt from the main cottage. He was back in a bespoke Italian suit, a glass of expensive Barolo in his hand. "You always were too smart for your own good, Clara, but you underestimated the old-world connections. Alessandro and I have been partners before you knew how to write a line of code. You thought you evicted us. You just gave us a reason to move faster." "I didn't underestimate you, Dad," I said, walking to the center of the room and opening my laptop. "I just waited for you to be in the same jurisdiction as the crimes you committed. You see, the merger I discussed with Alessandro isn't a business deal, it's a structured disclosure." "What are you talking about?" Alessandro's voice sharpened, his hand moving toward the phone on the desk. "Stay where you are, Alessandro. 10 minutes ago, I uploaded the final ledger of the De Rossi water rights sale, the one from 2 years ago, to the Guardia di Finanza portal. I also included the records of the $4 million you laundered through the De Rossi subsidiary to pay off your family's debts. In Italy, that's not just fraud. It's a violation of anti-money laundering statutes that carry a mandatory 15-year sentence." My father stood up, the glass of wine trembling in his hand. "You're bluffing. You never expose yourself. Vantex is tied to these shell companies." "No, Dad, you are tied to them. I spent the last 3 days decoupling Vantex. I filed a voluntary disclosure with the SEC in the States, taking the hit for discovering your unauthorized activities. I paid the fine. Vantex is clean, but you and Alessandro, you're the ones holding the bag of stolen money in a room full of hidden cameras." I pointed to the small, ornate clock on the mantelpiece. Inside the casing, a tiny blue light flickered. Alessandro lunged at me, but the heavy oak doors of the library burst open. 6 officers in the dark uniforms of the Guardia di Finanza stepped into the room, their weapons holstered, but their presence absolute. A high-ranking officer, Colonel Moretti, stepped forward, holding a stack of warrants. "Signor De Rossi, Signor Vance, you are arrested for international financial fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy."
The look on my father's face was something I will never forget. It wasn't just fear, it was the total, shattering realization that the shadow daughter had finally stepped into the light, and it was blinding him. "Clara," he screamed as the officers pulled his arms behind his back, "you're my father. You can't do this. You're destroying your own blood." "You destroyed the blood when you stole my life to pay for a lie. I'm just the one who finally called for an audit. Goodbye, Richard. I hope the Italian prison system is as old world as you like it." They were led out of the room in silence. The library, once a place of conspiratorial whispers, was now just an empty room filled with the smell of spilled wine and the echoes of a fallen empire. I walked out into the cool Florentine night. Colonel Moretti was waiting by my car. "The evidence was flawless, Signora Vance," he tipped his cap. "The water rights will be frozen by the state, but as the primary victim of the fraud, your company will have the first right of acquisition at the public auction next month. You will own the valley legally and cleanly." "Thank you, Colonel," I said, sliding into the back seat. As we drove away from the villa, I looked out at the lights of Florence. The circle was closed, the thieves were in cages, and for the first time in my life, the Vantex engine wasn't running on rage. It was running on peace. I took out my phone and dialed Elena. "The Florence operation is complete. Tell the board to prepare for the acquisition of the De Rossi lands. And Elena, buy Isabella a one-way ticket to Maine. She's going to need someone to help her pack the cottage." The trap had snapped shut, the castle had its water, and I finally had my name.
Power is not just a matter of deeds and bank accounts, it is a matter of perception. In the boardroom of Silicon Valley, I was a titan. In the courtroom of Florence, I was a victim seeking justice. But in the vineyards of the Val d'Orcia, I was something else, the foreigner who had dared to topple a dynasty. I had the castle, the water rights, and the legal victory, but I was sitting on an empty throne. The people who tilled the soil, the families who had served the De Rossis for generations, looked at me as if I had stolen the sun from their sky. The silence in the valley after the arrests was deceptive. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of a held breath. My acquisition of the De Rossi lands was legally sound, but practically, I was facing a ghost strike. The workers didn't show up to the vineyards. The local suppliers lost my orders for the hotel conversion. Even the village priest looked away when I walked past the piazza. I sat in my office at the Castello, staring at a map of the region. "They won't work for me, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing in the stone room. "They see me as the woman who put their count in a cell. They don't care about the fraud. They care about the stability they lost." "It's worse than that, Clara," Marcus said, his face grim. "Your mother, Beatrice, is at the gate. She didn't come with a lawyer this time. She came with a box of old documents she says belonged to your grandmother. She claims there's a codicil in the original Vance Trust that makes the $4 million withdrawal technically legal under specific familial emergency clauses." I felt a surge of cold fury. My mother, the woman who lived a life of pampered ignorance, was now playing amateur attorney to save the man who treated her like a trophy? I walked down to the main courtyard, the same place where I had stopped the wedding. Beatrice stood there, looking fragile and aged, clutching a tattered leather portfolio. "Clara," she said, her voice shaking but determined, "you have to stop this. Richard is a foolish man, but he is not a criminal. He was trying to restore what was lost. Your grandmother, she knew the family would face hard times. She left a clause. If the family's social standing was at risk, the principal could be accessed without the primary beneficiary's consent." "Social standing?" I laughed, the sound harsh against the ancient stone. "You think a wedding is a familial emergency, Mother? You think my life's work is a slush fund for Isabella's vanity? If that clause exists, it's a relic of a sexist era that I will dismantle in court."
"It's not just about the money, Clara," Beatrice said, her eyes filling with tears. "If you use those documents to destroy Richard, you destroy the Vance name forever. You'll be the queen of a mountain of ash. Is that what you want? To be completely alone in this beautiful prison?" I didn't answer. I took the portfolio from her hands. "Go back to the hotel, Mother. I'll look at your legacy, but don't mistake my curiosity for mercy." I spent the night in the library, the glow of my laptop the only light in the room. I went through the yellowed papers. My grandmother, Eleanor Vance, had indeed been a woman of her time, a time when daughters were seen as bargaining chips and sons as the only true heirs. The social standing clause was real, written in flowery, archaic legalese. It was a loophole wide enough to drive a limousine through. But as I dug deeper, I found something Beatrice hadn't mentioned, or perhaps something she hadn't understood. Eleanor Vance hadn't just protected the family's standing, she had protected the source of the wealth. There was a secondary provision. If the protector of the legacy, the one who earned the wealth, was threatened by the consumers of the legacy, those who spent it, the protector had the right to initiate a total severance of blood. My grandmother hadn't been a victim of her era. She had been a silent architect. She had known that one day a woman like me would arise, and she had given me the ultimate weapon, the legal right to erase Richard and Isabella from the Vance family tree, reclaiming every asset, every title, and even the right to the name itself. I realized then that I didn't need to put my father in a cell for 15 years to win. I could do something much more permanent. I could make him a nobody by his own family's law. But the valley was still silent. The workers were still absent. I looked out the window and saw a small group of vineyard workers standing at the edge of the property, their hats in their hands. They weren't protesting, they were waiting. "Marcus," I called out, "find out who the head of the local agricultural union is. I don't want to talk to their lawyers, I want to talk to the man who knows the vines." The man's name was Enzo. He was 70 years old, with skin like cured leather and hands that smelled of earth and grapes. We met in the castle's cellar, surrounded by barrels that had been there before my great-grandfather was born. "You think I am the enemy, Enzo," I said, pouring him a glass of the Di Rossi Reserve. "You think I took your count. But tell me, did the Count ever pay you on time? Did he ever invest in the irrigation you begged for? Or did he just spend the vineyard's blood on silk suits in Milan?" Enzo looked at the wine, then at me. "The Count was a Di Rossi, Signora. He was the soil. You are the machine." "The machine is what will keep the soil from drying up," I said, leaning forward. "I have the water rights now, not because I stole them, but because I saved them from being sold to an international conglomerate. If I hadn't stepped in, this valley would have been paved over for a luxury outlet mall within 5 years. I'm not here to replace the Count. I'm here to be the patron." I showed him the blueprints, not for the hotel, but for a cooperative winery, where the workers would own a percentage of every bottle produced. I offered them healthcare, modern equipment, and a future where their children didn't have to leave for the cities to find work. "I am a Vance," I said. "We build things. Sometimes we have to tear down the old walls to see the view, but the foundation remains. Will you work with the machine to save the soil?" Enzo took a slow sip of the wine. He looked at the blueprints, then at the ancient walls of the cellar. "The Di Rossis were the past, Signora. They were a beautiful story that ended in a lie. Maybe it is time for a story that begins with a contract." By the next morning, the vineyards were full of life again. The ghost strike was over. I had won the valley, not with an eviction notice, but with a promise of partnership. but I still had the portfolio Beatrice had given me. I sat at my desk, the severance of blood document prepared and ready for my signature. With one stroke of a pen, I could strip Richard of his name and his defense. I could let him rot in the Florence prison. I looked at the signature line. I looked at the photograph of me and Isabella as children, the one my mother had left in the box. "Elena," I said, my voice echoing in the empty solar, "prepare the car. I'm going to the prison. I have a legacy to discuss with my father. And call my mother. Tell her the social standing clause has been reviewed, and the audit is final." The throne wasn't empty anymore, but the queen was about to decide who, if anyone, was allowed to stay in the kingdom.
The visiting room of the Florence prison smelled of cheap tobacco and cold marble, a stark contrast to the lavender-scented halls of Castello di Pietra. I sat behind the reinforced glass, clutching the portfolio Eleanor Vance had left behind. My father looked diminished in his prison jumpsuit, the tailored elegance of his former life stripped away to reveal the hollow core of a man who lived on credit. But even in chains, Richard Vance had one more play. He didn't look at me with regret. He looked at me with the predatory glint of someone who had found a new loophole. "You look tired, Clara," my father said, his voice crackling through the intercom. "Ownership is a heavy crown, isn't it? I heard the workers went back to the fields. You always were good at bribing people with logic. But you've made a strategic error. You think this is just about money and contracts. You forget that in Italy, blood still dictates the law of the land." "I haven't forgotten anything, Richard," I replied, opening the portfolio. "I have the severance of blood document right here. With my signature, you cease to exist as a Vance. Your legal defense fund, which is currently tied to the family trust, will vanish. You'll be assigned a state-appointed lawyer who won't even remember your name by the time the trial starts." My father laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Sign it then. Erase me. But while you're busy playing judge, your sister is in a private clinic in Lucca. She's not just depressed, Clara. She's pregnant. Alessandro's child, the heir of the Duremsi." I felt the air leave the room. The logic of the acquisitions suddenly shifted. Under ancient Tuscan land laws, laws that even my grandmother's codicils couldn't fully override, a male heir born of the De Rossi bloodline had a preemptive right to the ancestral lands, provided the mother was legally tied to the estate. If Isabella had a son, the Vantex retreat would be tied up in litigation for the next 20 years. "A convenient miracle, isn't it?" I said, my voice ice cold. "Isabella, the girl who couldn't remember to pay her phone bill, is suddenly carrying a legal weapon?" "It's not a miracle, it's biology," Richard smirked, "and Alessandro knows. His lawyers are already preparing the motion to freeze the auction of the water rights. You might own the stones today, Clara, but the womb owns the future. If you want this to go away, if you want to keep your precious castle, you'll drop the charges, you'll restore our accounts, and we'll go back to being a family, a very wealthy, very quiet family." I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. I didn't say a word. I walked out of the prison and into the blinding Florentine sun. I didn't call Marcus. I didn't call my lawyers. I drove straight to the clinic in Lucca. I found Isabella in a suite that looked more like a 5-star hotel than a medical facility, another expense I was unknowingly funding through a secondary insurance policy. She was sitting by the window, looking out at the mountains. She looked smaller, her vanity replaced by a strange, vacant stillness. "Is it true?" I asked, standing in the doorway. She didn't look at me. "Dad told you. I knew he would. He's already talking about the Prince of the Valley. He's already planning how to spend the settlement you're going to give us to make the lawsuit go away."
I'm not asking about Dad's plans, Isabella, I said, walking toward her. I'm asking if you are carrying Alessandro's child, because if you are, you're not just a sister anymore. You're a liability that I will have to manage with the same cold precision I used on the castle. Isabella turned to me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't reflected in a mirror. It was fear. Real, unadorned fear. "He's not going to use you anymore, Isabella," she whispered. "Not Dad, not Alessandro, and not me." I took out my phone and dialed Marcus. "Cancel the press release about the auction. And Marcus, I need a private medical forensic team at the Lucca Clinic in 1 hour. We're going to verify the pregnancy, but not for the courts. We're going to verify it for a different kind of contract." I looked at Isabella. "If you want this child, Isabella, you will have it, but not as a De Rossi heir, and not as a Vance trophy. You will have it as a ward of Vantex. I will set up a trust that neither Dad nor Alessandro can touch, but in exchange, you sign a statement today, a full sworn affidavit detailing exactly how Dad planned to use this pregnancy to obstruct justice. You'd help me?" Isabella asked, a tear finally escaping her sunglasses. "Even after what I did?" "I'm not doing it for you, Isabella," I said, reaching for my pen. "I'm doing it because the Vance legacy isn't about castles or counts. It's about not letting the thieves win, even the ones who share our blood." I signed the severance of blood document, but I didn't sign the one for Richard. I signed a new one, a total asset freeze and a guardianship for Isabella. My father thought he found a loophole. He didn't realize that in my world, every loophole is just a place to install a new security patch. The Prince of the Valley wasn't going to save him. He was just going to provide the evidence for his final downfall. The bells of Florence's Duomo echoed through the streets as I walked toward the Palazzo di Giustizia for the final sentencing. It had been 9 months since the day I stood at the altar of Castello di Pietra and demanded an eviction. 9 months of legal warfare, board meetings, and a silence that stretched across the Atlantic. I had won the battle for the stones, the water, and the company. But as I entered the courtroom, I knew this wasn't about winning anymore. It was about closing the ledger on the people I had called my family. The courtroom was a grand, vaulted space, a reminder that human law is as old as the mountains of Tuscany. My father sat behind a wooden desk, his shoulders slumped, his hair now a shock of pure white. He didn't look like a titan or a thief. He looked like a man who had finally run out of time and credit. Alessandro was not there. His family had settled out of court, paying a staggering sum for the water rights and a permanent gag order, before retreating to a quiet villa in Switzerland, their reputation in Italy effectively extinguished. Isabella sat on my side of the room. She was no longer the girl in the lace dress. She wore a simple navy sweater, and her hands rested on her swollen stomach. She had fulfilled her part of our contract. Her sworn affidavit had been the final nail in Richard's coffin, detailing every offshore account and every whispered instruction to manipulate the trust. She hadn't done it for revenge. She had done it for the small heartbeat she now carried. The judge, a woman with eyes like flint, began to read the sentence. Richard Vance was found guilty on all counts of international fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny. Due to his age and his cooperation, forced as it was, he was sentenced to 8 years in a minimum security facility outside of Rome. I didn't feel the surge of triumph I expected. I felt a profound, echoing stillness. I looked at my father as the officers stood to lead him away. For a fleeting second, our eyes met. He didn't scream this time. He just looked at me with a hollow, haunting realization. He had spent his life building a legacy, only to be erased from it by the daughter he never bothered to know. "Take him," the judge said, and just like that, Richard Vance was gone from the public record of the Vance family. We returned to the Castello di Pietra that evening. The hotel was now fully operational, a masterpiece of sustainable luxury. The workers who once looked at me with suspicion now greeted me as the patroness. They knew their jobs were secure, their children's futures funded by the cooperative trust I had established. The machine and the soil had found a way to breathe together. My mother, Beatrice, was waiting on the terrace. She had been living in a small apartment in Florence, funded by a modest annuity I had set up for her, one that came with a strict no-contact clause regarding my father. She stood by the ancient stone railing, looking out over the vineyards. "You really did it, Clara. You saved the stones, but the soul of the family, it's gone, isn't it?" "The soul you're talking about was a parasite, Mother," I replied, standing beside her. "It lived on lies and stolen dreams. I didn't kill it, I just stopped feeding it." Isabella joined us, walking slowly. She looked at the courtyard where her wedding was supposed to have reached its peak. "I used to hate you so much, Clara, for stopping the music, for making me look small." "I know," I said. "But last night," her voice softened, "I felt her move, and I realized that if you hadn't stopped it, she would have been born into a prison of debt and pretense. She would have been just another pawn for Dad to play. You didn't just evict us, Clara. You evicted the lies." I reached out and touched my sister's shoulder. It was the first time I had touched her in years without the intent to manage or control. "She'll have a different name, Isabella, not De Rossi, not Vance. We'll call her Elena, after our grandmother, the woman who left us the keys to our own freedom." A few weeks later, the final documents for the severance of blood were processed. I was no longer the shadow daughter. I was the sole steward of the Vance legacy. But the name didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like a clean slate. I sat in the highest tower of the castle, the sun setting over the valley, painting the world in shades of burnt orange and deep gold. I took out the $4 million ledger, the one that had started it all. With a single keystroke, I archived it. The debt was settled, not with money, but with the complete restructuring of our lives. My phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "Clara, the board is asking about the next acquisition. There's a tech hub in Berlin that's looking for a partner. They want to know your strategy." I looked out at the peaceful vineyards, at the workers heading home, at the life I had built from the ruins of a betrayal. "The strategy is simple, Marcus," I said. "We build for the long term, no shortcuts, no social standing plays. We only invest in things that have a foundation of truth. And Marcus, tell them I'm taking a month off. I have a niece arriving soon, and I intend to be there to welcome her to the real world." I hung up and stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cool, smelling of rosemary and wood smoke. Below, in the courtyard, I saw Beatrice and Isabella sitting together in the twilight. The family wasn't perfect. It was broken, fragmented, and small. But it was honest. I had been the landlord of their ruin, the auditor of their sins, and the executioner of their vanity. But in the end, I had become the architect of my own peace. The Castello di Pietra was no longer a theater for a fake wedding. It was a fortress for a real life. The eviction notice had been the best wedding gift I ever gave, to myself. I took a deep breath, the ancient stones beneath my feet feeling solid and permanent. I wasn't alone. I was the master of my house, the owner of my soul, and for the first time in 30 years, the ledger was perfectly, beautifully balanced. "Phase 8 complete," I whispered to the rising moon. "The audit is closed." I walked down the spiral staircase, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone. It wasn't the sound of a drumbeat for a funeral. It was the sound of a woman walking towards her own future. The fairy tale was dead. Long live the reality.